Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Hi, this is Farnoosh Torabi, host of the Webby winning podcast, So Money. If you're aiming for a goal, be it saving for a house, growing your family, or retiring, life makes it difficult to stay the course. But with a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan and a clear path forward. Having the bull at your back helps your whole financial life move with you. So when your plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
Hello, welcome to this. It is the Eggonomics Podcast, the podcast all about rugby and business, brought to you by Beardmore Independent Financial Advisors. Planning, pensions, investments, protection, and all of that other good stuff. You can find us by visiting our website, Beardmore IFA, or you can just contact me on LinkedIn, where you can find me at Jonathan Beardmore. Anyway, I'll be joined by Mark Evans in 1 second, but before I do, I want to tell you about our main podcast, EggChasers, which I'm sure you're all aware of, as well as Tim Cocker's YouTube channel, also called EggChasers, and is going great guns. So go and follow him there, go and press subscribe, and if you like all this content, you're bound to love that. Okay, if you're new to this version of our podcast, I'll be joined by Mark in 1 second. Mark was the CEO of Harlequins. He worked in senior positions in Saracens and across the sport, and is currently in charge of the Fiji Drua franchise. So, without any further waiting, Mark, how are you?
I'm very well. Back in the UK. Happy Christmas.
Yes, Merry Christmas to you too. Now, what is happening in your world at the moment? Because you're not that far away from the season, are you not?
Not far. Well, middle of Feb. So, boys came back. A lot of them came back off the Flying Fijian, so they didn't have much of a break. It's the first time we've had such a big international program for a while. But yeah, it's good. Went off to Kandabal, which is one of the other islands, for a pre-season camp for 3 or 4 days, which was good. Just before Christmas, I didn't go, but I'm told it went really well. And we're back on the 6th of January. I think that's right. Maybe is it the 6th? Is it the 4th? I can't remember exactly. For the last sort of 5-6 weeks before the season.
No, you don't have a long season at all, really. So what do your boys do when they're not playing? When they're not playing Drua?
Well, 25 of them played for Fiji over the summer. Well, the summer. Between July and November, so a lot of them are playing a perfect season, actually, in many ways. They play 13, 14, 15 games for us, and they play 9, 10, 11 for the country, and that's a perfect season, really.
Goodness me, it is, isn't it?
Just over 20 games, a lot of travelling. I mean, they did so if you were someone like like Texi Veneri as our hooker, he played 14 or 15 games for us, and then he's played pretty much every game or on the bench for Fiji, been to Georgia, the States, Samoa, Japan, Ireland, Scotland, Spain, etc. There's a lot of travelling as well. So, but it's the ones that it's more of a challenge is the ones who aren't in the team. But that's a combination of if they're young enough, they play under 20s World Cup. They play in domestic competition called the Skipper Cup at times, play for their province. Or some go and play NPC in New Zealand, or Shoot Shield, or Hospitals Cup in Australia. So it's quite individualised, really. I mean, there's a little group who are probably just out of under 20s, who we'd like to see play a little more, but it's decent. There's usually, you can usually find someone for them to play for match day practice, I suppose the other thing is don't make the squad too big. So the squad's 37. You pick 23 every week for Super Rugby. There'll always be 8 or 9 injured. So, there's not too many people twiddling their thumbs, as it were.
Tell you what, it sounds a lot easier to manage doing 20 games a year across basically 2 organisations for the senior lads than what you had at Harlequins. I mean, I think 20 games is still too many by about 3 or 4, but it's far better than, say, if you're managing a Premiership squad.
It probably, that's the advantage you've got in somewhere like England or France, is you've got an awful lot of other teams and other levels. So dual registration, etc.
Yeah.
Whereas in Fiji, you're a long, long way from anywhere else, unless you're going to play for a provincial team in Fiji. So if someone's going to go and play for, I don't know, Randwick in the Shute Shield, that's a long way.
Is it? Well, yeah. I mean, it is. But I mean, do you send lads on loan to places like that?
Yeah, you do. Or they go for the whole, and then they tend to go for the whole season. Or part of, a whole chunk of time. So it tends to be, you might send somebody if they're very young. Let's say sometimes you might have a 4th scrum half or a 4th hooker. You might send them over in March, April, May. But normally you'd sort of send them July, August, that sort of time. July, August, September. So someone like, we had one of our hookers, a good player, so Z didn't get much game time during the Super Rugby, just the way, no injuries and all that. Got to come off the bench a bit, but he went over and played for counties and played 10 weeks in a row in the NPC or Mitre Cup. So that worked out really well for him. So you've got to individualise it to a degree. Yeah.
Right, well, let's get into this, because I think the biggest scandal, for want of a better word, since we last spoke, would be Bill Sweeney's pay packet, which keeps on coming back and coming back and coming back.
That story is not dying, is it?
It is not dying, and I think it's getting quite important now because Tom Aloob has lost his job, which I think is probably justified. But before I give my opinions, and I have given my opinions at length actually on EggChasers, I was wondering what your opinions were on the whole thing.
Well, it's clearly a story that's touched a nerve in the game, isn't it?
Yes.
There's no doubt about that. Was it Alistair Campbell who said if a story goes more than 3 days, you've got trouble?
Yes.
And this one's been going for weeks and weeks and weeks. I think it's interesting. You've got to think, well, what is it about this story that's given it such legs? And I think there's a number of things going on here. First of all, the optics look terrible. For this, there's an interesting debate which we might go on to whether this type of long-term incentive package, which is reasonably common in the large corporate world, is appropriate for a member-owned union, and I might come back to that and why. And then you've got to look at it and say, well, even if it is, and that's quite a big even if it is it appropriate in a year when the same organisations had to make a reasonably significant number of redundancies? And that's not a good look. And I'm sure that the 6 people, I think it is, did meet the terms of the arrangement. In other words, they hit the targets that were set. But given some of the other things that's happened during that same time period, you've really got to wonder whether they were the appropriate targets.
Yes.
whether it be, and then there's some things that have really irritated people. I mean, that blending thing where they put the men's and the women's results together has just struck people as a way of making sure that targets are hit. It feels like a fudge.
I mean, that bonus is worth £358,000. Now, I don't know what the women's budget is, right? But it strikes me that blending to award that amount of money to Bill Sweeney is probably a significant portion of the entire women's budget. I wouldn't be surprised if it's like, I don't know, 25% of the women's budget. So it just feels, it just feels wrong.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
So there's that. I think people are focused on Bill Sweeney, and I think that's understandable. That's just the way the reporting works. They'll tend to personalise it, but it was 6 people, and you've got to ask whether or not that's an acceptable way or a sensible way to run the union. And therefore, people say, well, you wouldn't turn it down if it was you, would you?
No.
But actually, people do turn down bonuses in certain circumstances.
Well,
I hate to draw the analogy, but another group of people, those who head up our rather, let's be kind, our rather patchy water companies, a number of them have turned down bonuses not all and not every year, but have turned down bonuses they were entitled to because they didn't think it was appropriate.
Well, it's an economic decision.
And
that is more of an economic decision, isn't it? Which is they're looking at their already very healthy pay packets. I'm thinking, if I take this bonus, I will have to give up my healthy pay packet because I'll have to resign. So I don't necessarily think it's one of those things where, oh, this is good judgment.
No, I don't
self-interested.
I don't think that's true. No.
Do you not think?
What they did was that no, I don't think that's true. No, I think that their decision, which is what I'm sort of hinting at, is if you're already on a decent salary and you are entitled to a bonus and there are other things going on, that when you look at it, you think, well, you know what? That probably isn't appropriate. I'll turn that down. That does happen reasonably frequently for a whole host of reasons. And I think the other thing, blending was one. I think the increase over the last 5 years of the base salary, which has gone public as well, has probably irritated a fair few people. And so, well, isn't that sufficient? I mean, that really has been a pretty sizable increase on your base salary over a relatively short period of time. And I think that also, as we've hinted at, that when the headline team is not doing great, and I do accept there's much more to running the RFU than just the performance of the national team. Nevertheless, it is a big headline of the performance of the organisation, and England's performance in recent years has been pretty patchy. There've been some there have been some decent wins. I mean, I thought Borthwick and his group did really well to get to the semi-final. You got the under-20s winning an international title, but overall, you wouldn't say it was an exceptional performance, I don't think.
No.
So I think that's irritated people as well. So all in all, it's touched a nerve. And as a result, the reaction has been pretty ferocious.
It has. Well, let me just hold there, because I just want to run something past you and then ask you a further question, which is my rudimentary understanding of corporate structure is that the board is there not to facilitate what Bill Sweeney wants or what the CEO wants, but to hold the CEO to account. Would you say that's broadly the correct interpretation?
It's part of what the board is there for. The board's also got a strategic role, and it's also got a role in things like and different board members have got a different role. Certain, and this is not just true and it's not a direct analogy either. A corporate board will have, as does the RFU. It'll have independent board members, but the governance of the RFU is slightly different again. Of course, it's got council, which is
we'll come to
different again. And over the years, there's been many debates about what's the role of council. And I remember times when people argued, I think correctly, that council was too big because it was a sort of a representative body representing the different elements of the union, and it was unwieldy and it was impossible to manage given that larger group. So we should have an executive board, and that's what many sports organisations have now got, this sort of broader representative group, which is interesting. Of course, the council had the power to push for the removal of the chair, but not for the removal of the CEO, because that falls within the remit of the board. It's a different group. So I don't think it's just about holding the executive to account. The board has got an executive role in terms of determining strategy and priorities, which the management then have a duty to execute to the best of their ability. And that's how the governance model works, basically.
So just give me an example. At Harlequins, for example, how was your board made up, or indeed Drua? And can you give me any examples of the board going against your wishes or holding you to account where you wanted to do something and they would say, no, actually, we don't think that's a good idea, or an example of difference?
Yeah, that. I mean, most boards, rugby clubs or rugby unions, they're a mix of. I'll take the Drua for the minute. We've got a 5-man board. We have two representative the shareholders, and it's slightly different, of course, because when you have shareholders, it's slightly different, which the rugby union doesn't have, and lots of the governing bodies sporting governing bodies don't have.
Just on that, aren't the proxy shareholders the clubs, I guess, and the members?
Well, yes, by proxy, that's true. So we'll come back to that. So we have two members of the board who are shareholders representing the two major shareholders, and then we have 3 independents, and they were selected on a skills basis. In other words, we looked for people who basically covered certain areas. So we were looking for somebody who had experience in a sort of legal and governance field. We were looking for someone who had rugby administration experience, and we were looking for somebody who had a sort of marketing and sales and ideally government background, which was a difficult one, but we did find somebody in the end. She's been great.
Marketing experience and government.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating mix.
So government in terms of, mainly because the role of the government in sport in Fiji is quite significant. Yeah. So we were looking for someone who had a lot of experience in working in that type of area of sort of developing and middle and low income countries and all that kind of stuff. We thought that would be useful, and it has proved to be so. So, if you're trying to get a skills based board, you're looking to sort of balance up and not have people trying to have people with complementary skills and at the same time representing, horrible word, but inevitable, the stakeholders and the shareholders. So, in terms of the role, and do they ever sort of say to the executive, no, we don't want you to focus on that, or we'd like you to put more emphasis on this, or we want you to consider that. I mean, that happens all the time. And they'll do things like, we'd like to know more about X. Can you prepare a report for the next board? And we'll put 40 minutes aside to discuss that. So, which you might not well have put on the agenda, or you might not have put forward in your report if it had not been specifically requested to. And then there comes times in moments of crisis or whatever where they might ask the chief exec to stand down, or they might insist on might insist on an expansion of the senior management group if they think there's a gap, or request for some kind of external support in a particular area, like finance, for example. So, a well-operated and well-run board has a range of functions, only one of which is sort of, challenging the management, which good boards do, but also sometimes trying to sort of change the focus, I suppose, or try to give certain greater emphasis to an area that otherwise was taking place.
So, just give me the example of Harlequins then. Where were the main points of contention, if there were any, between you and the board? Like, what would they want to focus on, and what would you want to focus on? Or what would they want to emphasise more than you?
What I suppose areas of contention. Well, the Harlequins board was an interesting mix, and it's changed. So, and the board composition does change, and the makeup does change over time. And it was a long time ago, but the Quins board. Well, let me give another example on top again. So Melbourne Storm, another one that I remember, was entirely shareholder board. Everybody every single person on that board, including myself, and I was a director there, which I'm not at the Drua, owned a piece of the company. So it was that was quite unusual for a rugby club. There were no independents. There was nobody on that board who didn't have a financial interest in the organisation.
Okay.
Quite unusual, that.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Yeah, and particularly since previously it had been owned by News Corporation, and the board reflected that. This one, I think there were 5 people on the board, 4 or 5, five, and they all earned a percentage of the company. So that was a board that was very much sort of, right, well, we've all invested in this. We don't want to lose our money, so we want it to, turn around financially and hopefully give us a return. So that was a quite very sort of clear kind of outcome the board were looking for. Quins was the owners of were there, but certainly in the early days there was still something called a golden share, whereby the club, as it were, who'd sold to the owners in 97, I think, who are still there today, have been absolutely magnificent. They've been there, nearly 30 years. But in order to maintain some kind of control, they had 2 directors, and they had things like the golden share said things like, rugby must be played at the stoop, things like that.
Yeah.
And they could block anything which threatened that, regardless of what the rest of the board said, things like that. So there's lots of different ways. And then people, robust boards have robust conversations about all kinds of things. I mean, the one in the early days at Quins, it was always a debate about, look, we've only got a certain amount of money. Where do we allocate our resources? We're still going to make a loss, but it must be a loss that's fundable, and that means we've got to make some tough choices between how much do we put into developing the ground, how much do we put into player development in terms of the academy, how much should simply go into the first team squad because we need to be at a certain, or what level do we need, how important is to us at the moment. I mean, that's all about what your strategic plan and strategic direction is, and those are the sorts of things that good boards have. I know it sounds like a bit of a sort of polite language, but it's not. It's have robust decisions and robust conversations about, and hopefully finally come to a collective agreement. I'm trying to think how many things have ever, on all the ones I've sat on, excuse me, ever came to a vote. Very, 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 I can't think of one, really.
Really?
It usually comes to very, very unusual that it came to a vote. I mean, there were differences, some, of emphasis, but it rarely came to a sort of, it would be more like you go, let's take something like the budget. You'd say, well, people go, well, okay, I think I can remember this happening quite recently. But the first budget went up and the board went, we're not comfortable with that kind of, the profitability is a bit tight. We think that we want to go back and have another cut at that. We feel it's a bit risky. And that's fine. So I did. That's their job.
Yeah, so, thinking this through now, I really like the model of the Storm. And the reason I like that is because of the direct accountability to the end beneficiary. And I was just thinking this now, this is just me thinking aloud. One of the things I really struggle with England and all of these member-owned unions is that because it's member-owned and because the accountability isn't quite so strong, they end up not just representing or not just trying to benefit the beneficiaries, which should be the shareholders, members by proxy, but almost like an imaginary group of stakeholders or imaginary group of beneficiaries who don't yet exist. So we start talking about growing the game or attracting new people in, which does sound like it's of benefit to the wider game. But in the end, you start making concessions, you start doing things for people that don't exist. And I think the RFU are very guilty of this.
Well, I think, to be fair to the RFU, the remit of a governing body, it's not just the RFU, the remit of a governing body is much, much wider and more complicated and more complex than the remit of an individual club or participant, which is where my experience largely lies. I suppose, I've chaired a league in netball for a while, and that is that again, that's quite specific. But when you're running something like the FA or the Rugby Union or any of the big governing bodies, you've got, I suppose, I think I might have said this on this, I don't know if it's on this show, but I might have said it before, you've got three major areas that you could probably put most of your work into one of the two of these three. Again, probably slightly different at the moment. One, the national team. I mean, everyone agrees. If it doesn't matter which sport you're running, if you're an individual sport, the success of your elite athletes at world level or European level. So that's undoubtedly a focus. Secondly, increasing the number of people who are involved and participating, either as volunteers or players or referees or in some cases, not all, in some cases, spectators.
Yeah.
In other words, how do we make in a very competitive landscape, how do we make our sport thrive in terms of involvement and popularity and growth? I mean, I think virtually every governing body would have that as a focus. And then the third, which is only for some sports, and in rugby they sort of half do this because of the way that the Premiership has grown up. But in lots of other sports, if and when they become popular enough, and some never do, how do you organise and run your competitions in terms of national leagues or regional cups or whatever it might be? Okay, so so you've got lots of examples all over the world whereby, so take rugby league in Australia, and the governing body there runs the whole lot from the national team through state of origin to the NRL to the state leagues and everything in between. They just run the whole sport. And then their role is an interesting balancing because because again, it comes down to resources. At what particular point in time do you emphasize different elements of that role? I remember, interestingly, the Rugby Union used to have, and I don't think they have it anymore, and I think this is I do think this is a mistake. I apologise if I get the numbers wrong. It's been a while, but certainly under a previous regime, particularly when Francis Barron was the CEO, which is going back a little while.
Yeah, it is.
They had a sort of internal split whereby the revenue that was generated was ring-fenced so much for the, inverted commas, community game and so much for the elite or professional game, including the national team. but also including any, in rugby case, any funding of the Premiership and age group teams, etc., etc. And the argument for that was, if you're not very careful, you get unbalanced, and that role of my sort of visual on this is always the 3-bucket theory. No one else calls it that, but which is, I got 3 buckets, and I've got a certain amount of money in the short run, plus I may be borrowing or whatever, but I've got a certain number of resources. How much do I put to the elite side of the game? How much do I put to the participation side of the game? And how much do I put into sort of promoting, organising and growing the competitions, which might then, and across a lot of those, there'll be things that go into all 3. So let's say facility development. Okay, on the one hand, you might say, well, we need to keep improving and updating the national stadium because you have to, because that's where a lot of our revenue comes from. You might say, well, actually, we want to have a program in the next 10 years to increase the number of all-weather pitches to improve participation. Right? Well, that's it. And then on the third one, you might say, well, actually, one of the things that we'd like to sort of drive, because we think it'll help us in terms of our broadcast revenues in the long run, we need to have a program which includes floodlighting in our major venues, not just the National Stadium, because it'll give us much greater breadth in terms of timing of games, and therefore, in the long run, it's an investment. Right, so no, all 3 of those things are just examples of capital spending across the union, across the organisation, that may or may not take place. But and then you could say, well, actually, capital's so important, let's take them out, those 3 buckets, let's have a capital fund, which then people bid into, or that we allocate on a similar, maybe, 40, 30, 30 principle, whatever the numbers might be. But at least it's an attempt to not allow the union become lopsided and concentrating overly on the very high-profile national team bit. And it's the same at club level. The constant debate is, I'm sure at the moment, do we spend to the salary cap? Right? And do we take advantage of every single exemption? Or is that putting our club at risk and unbalancing us, when actually we should be $1 million under the salary cap and not taking all the exemptions and putting more money into the academy, or improving our ground really needs a couple of million spent on it to improve the facility and the customer experience, right? They're all trade-offs. I mean, that's the board's role, I suppose, and the executive's role. It's like, what's our strategy? Where are we? Where are our priorities? All the time is, what's the opportunity cost? For every dollar I could have spent on X, we could have chosen to spend it on Y.
Yeah.
And I suppose that is when you come down to it, that's the art of management, isn't it?
It is. Just a thought I've had when you were talking about unions. You said the FA, the RFU, and then you mentioned the NRL. No, the NRL, sorry, Australian Rugby League. And I thought, like, surely one of the issues that you've not addressed here is the sort of embedded conservatism of these institutions, because they are effectively institutions. They are very much in the eye of the public, and regardless of how big they are, I think the FA and the RFU certainly are always in the eye of the public, because they feel like big national bodies, big national institutions. How does Australia Rugby League deal with this? Because in my mind, that's one of the things which makes everything so difficult, particularly for the WRU as well, to make changes, because any kind of negative press, any kind of movement which is unpopular, they don't just have accountability to the press, but potentially some sort of Secretary of State somewhere. In fact, definitely a Secretary of State, because one of the scandals with the RFU is they had to have taxpayer-funded experts come in to help with the finances.
Well, I'm not going to go down that. That I think is a little bit of that's been painted in a way that I think is rather inaccurate. And I do remember where that came out of. And, frankly, I don't think that was came out of the whole COVID thing, didn't it? And people were on the select committee or whatever it was.
Yeah. And I don't think those guys should be appointed anyway.
Who got rather upset and understandably so. And this was part of the reaction. I wouldn't generalize on that particular example, but look, I think it's fair to say, and we came into this talking about remuneration, but certainly over the years, talking to people in various countries who've come into sports administration from other sectors, and in some cases, sectors and individual businesses that are far larger in turnover and revenue than what they go into in sport.
Yes.
But who say consistently, and I think without exception, the complexity of running a sports organisation is so much greater because of its visibility and the fact that people love their sport and are genuinely interested in it leads to a degree of scrutiny that is completely out of anything they'd ever experienced before, whether they came from, I don't know, consumer goods or banking wherever it might be.
You could presumably be in charge of a division of Unilever, which turns over several times more than the RFU, and nobody
would know who you are.
Yeah, exactly right.
Nobody would have any idea of who you are. The level of public profile and interest and is really. I'm struggling to think maybe of any other area that has that level of, it is interest. People don't really care very much about, nor do they know how Unilever is structured and where the governance lies. And maybe we should be more interested in, but actually we're not. We're interested in our club or our sport. And therefore, if things happen in it, it attracts our interest and we have opinions about it and people talk about it and they have a view, and therefore there's a level of accountability and public profile that, well, puts a lot of people off.
So I wonder if it's the other way around. So I was thinking about, if you need a really rare skill set to go and run, I don't know, the new incarnation of Worcester. Maybe you need to pay over the odds for that, because who wants to run Worcester, for instance? I mean, no disrespect to Worcester. If it's the RFU, it's kind of like, that is such a high-profile position. I'd expect you to take a pay cut for it. Some people in the past have done, and I take your point, that for some people, when they get there, they are still taken aback by the level of interest as much as anything. And the other thing you can guarantee is that when something goes wrong, and it will, you are operating very much in the public spotlight, and you haven't got an awful lot of time, and people want to know. I mean, one of the other things I think this has brought up, going back to the original, how we started this discussion, I think one of the things it has brought up is that it seems to have drawn fire, certainly from certain parts of the media, that the RFU has become less transparent in the way it communicates. Yes, I totally agree with this. I mean, not only do I agree with this, I've spoken to many journalists who tell me Bill Sweeney was not available for something like 18 months, just point blank would not give interviews. Yeah. I mean, he'd happily get on the phone to me and have a chat for a little while, but he wouldn't give any on the record interviews, which I think is strange.
And I think that's probably there's a balance to be had here, and possibly I think you have to accept that you don't want to be accused of somebody who's never willingly walked past a microphone, right? Which is the other end of the continuum. But on the but by the same token, I think you have to accept, for example, that part of the role is doing, whether they're on or off the record, regular briefings with the people whose job it is to report and communicate affairs of the organisation that you're running, because that's a journalist's job, be it whatever part of the media they work within. That's the whole point. In the same way that I don't have much truck. In fact, now you almost can't do it with, that back in the day, you used to have coaches who simply didn't talk to the media at all. And those days have gone, because it's now quite rightly seen is that not that it's the media are just a way through to the fan base. The fan base have got, and it's, when you've got to, and we've all been there, you've taken a pasting and then you've got to get up in front of however many people and however many cameras and, explain what's going on. And it's not, and you have to do it very quickly, and you're in quite an emotional state yourself. And, but that is part of the that is part of the gig.
I've got two thoughts on that. So my first thought is, being such a national institution as the RFU is, it gets coverage in the media which far outweighs its importance. Say boxing or UFC or NFL or all sorts of other things are bigger, I think, financially than rugby, but it is there. So one of the things I thought about this when the story broke is the RFU got criticised for making a loss this year. But anyone who knows rugby knows they always make a loss the year after a World Cup. Now, had Bill Sweeney been on the front foot, and this I think is probably a sign of lack of competence around communication, everyone would know that. That would be a thing which is well known, that during the World Cup we make lots of money, after the World Cup we make no money, for whatever reason that is, but this is the pattern which has gone on for 5 World Cups now. It's perfectly normal. Nobody panic. Now, maybe the loss is exceptionally large. Maybe that's a sign of more volatility. I don't know. But that is an easy win that he should have been communicating from day one, all the way through, to journalists, not just internally, to journalists. The second thing I wonder...
No, I tend to agree in the sense that everybody looks to... But part of the role is to portray the organisation you're running in a reasonably positive light. But so if you don't communicate, people over time, it doesn't happen immediately. Over time, then people sort of tend to not give you the benefit of the doubt.
Yes.
And I don't think in this particular end, if what I saw reported was true, I don't think it was helpful. The president apparently internally just talked about clickbait and
it's awful. That is.
That was really unfortunate.
It wasn't unfortunate. It was dismissive. It was unprofessional.
I think if he had his time again, he probably would not have said that. But
I think he said it for a reason. I hate that attitude of, we will dismiss what you say as clickbait or it's disingenuous. That's what he's saying, isn't he? He's saying to the rest of the council, you're being disingenuous asking these questions. For me, I think that's enough for someone to go, actually, because I resent that attitude so much. You've got representatives of your shareholders, and you tell them they're just looking for clickbait. And for me, that's kind of a line which I wouldn't cross. You take their concerns seriously.
Well, I think it's fair to say that I think there's a general feeling, certainly amongst members of the media that I'm sort of reasonably friendly with and talk to. Not I'm in Fiji most of the time, but I talk to on and off and have done for many, many years, where they feel that it's a bit sort of it's certainly something to be desired, and that there simply is not enough. There's not enough open and public communication with certain key members of the organisation. And once you do get that, yeah, it's easy enough, because partly because what we've talked about already, when it is a very public role and when it is an organisation in which there is a great deal of interest, you sometimes can, and to a degree it's understandable, you can get a little bit paranoid and you can feel that people are just, out to get you, and they're just looking for sensationalist stories and all the rest of it. But I'll be honest, you look at the way rugby is covered in England, certainly, I think it's reasonably fair and straightforward.
Yeah,
I'm not talking about coverage of the actual, games themselves. That's a different bit of the media. I'm talking about the way in which the sport is covered. I think, on the whole, we probably get more media than the sport sort of tends to justify in terms of its scale. And I think my argument would be possibly that the media don't scrutinise enough.
I completely agree. I think that
I do think this is not helped further by the fact that certainly you don't see much in the direct. Well, neither the recent chairman nor the current chief executive, for whatever reason, and I'm sure that if you spoke to them and they went on the record, they would give an explanation of this. So there may be good reasons for it, but they clearly took a view that this wasn't the way they were going to operate, rightly or wrongly. I would say that I would say that certainly it's difficult to run something with such a profile without having a pretty open and regular communications strategy. And things like putting whatever it was, putting the details on page 96 of the annual report and things, it doesn't feel quite open.
When you read the annual reports, and we tend to do that quite regularly on the podcast, you do feel that most of it, you're just being deceived. I mean, there are some elements of truth in it, and there's other things which are just wildly inaccurate. The classic I give is 120 million to the women's game, not funded. I mean, we should already have had £40 million worth spent by now, unless they're going to backload it, and I don't know where they're going to find 20 million now for the next 8 years, plus the other 40 million that they've yet to spend. So you read this stuff and you think it's trash. It's all trash. Why even waste your time? But back to your point on the media, I think that we have outsized coverage, but simultaneously we have very lopsided coverage. So I think journalists are very keen to get the latest England news, which is good. I mean, they're focusing mostly on the game, which is really quite positive.
And understandably so.
But they don't have the resources to dig deep into the RFU. And even if they did, good luck putting that into 700 to 1,000 words about the complexities of the president, the CEO, the council, whoever else it is. It's meaningless. When you write this stuff, for most people reading it, it's meaningless. Whereas if you wrote about the Premier League, you know who the characters are, you know who the heads of clubs are. It's much easier to understand. So I think I think actually that England team and the obsession with England, sometimes people think it's unhealthy, but it's also a very good shield for the RFU, because that's all really people care about. Is the national team doing well?
Well, look, the national team was there for 125 years before professional league took hold. Yeah. So it's unsurprising that we talk about this a lot, don't we? An awful lot of rugby followers follow the international game as opposed to the club game. And to be fair to the RFU, they don't run Premiership rugby. And actually, if I have some sympathy for the RFU over the years, it's that often they are held to account for the things for which they are not directly responsible. Bill Sweeney and the board were not directly responsible for the demise of 4 professional teams.
Nope.
and it's unreasonable.
But on that,
but they do, and we come back to something we've already talked about. They got a pounding, or he got a personal pounding in the select committee for exactly that. And I thought that was unreasonable and unfair. Now, you can argue that, of course, the Premiership should be within the auspices and control and mandate of the RFU, but the fact of the matter is that it isn't. That causes problems and all the rest of it. It also has some advantages, but for them to be held, and they have in the public mind, and here I think again this is quite tricky, but you see, in the public mind, people who don't follow the game acutely, anything to do with rugby comes under the RFU. In the same way, in football, anything to do with football comes under the FA. And neither of those things are true. The FA don't control the Premier League, far from it. They used to, but they no longer do. And the RFU have never controlled Premiership rugby.
But on that, to use my example again of the funding for the women's game, 22 million a year. When I asked an owner about that, I was like, well, where's this 22 million coming from? And he goes, it doesn't exist. They expect the clubs to fund it. So on the one hand, they don't have control, and they get blamed for things which are not in their control. But on the other hand, if you read their annual report, they are often committing money that the RFU doesn't have and expects clubs to stump up.
I'll be honest, Toby, I'm not familiar with the particular example that you're citing here. I'd be extraordinarily surprised if anything in that report, but you can point me to it,
absolutely,
is allocating money that they don't have control, because I don't think that would get past the auditor, frankly.
No, because it wasn't that we're going to spend this. It is our goal to spend 120 million over 10 years, I think it was.
That's an aspiration.
It's an aspiration, but where did that aspiration lie? So it lies not with their internal budgets, but with the largesse of owners.
Well, I think we could go down a rabbit hole now. I think I'm not prepared to take that at face value, to be fair. But you might be right. I think
I am right on this. I am on 100%
the whole
on this.
way in which we I think we're sort of off, but the whole way in which it comes back to this whole what's the role and how do you keep balance within the organisation, and that's always tricky. And then and this is why I suppose we maybe close this off, but why has this story run and run and run? I think it comes down to something around people are genuinely, have a genuine affection for their sport, whatever it might be. In this case, it's rugby. They have a sort of intuitive feel that they want it to be run fairly and in balance, and that on the surface, and they've got nothing to go on other than the surface, this type of significant increases for 5 years plus a long-term bonus of significant size at a time when the game has not had its best 3, 4, 5 year period just strikes them as unfair.
Yeah, I agree.
And unreasonable. And if you're not very careful, you look like you're simply in it for what you can get out of it.
Yeah, I think that's
and I'm sure that isn't true, but that is how it can appear. And you've got to be really careful about that, because once people think that, the story keeps going.
Yeah, so...
And this story has gone on now, and I don't think it's finished. And when you get... Is it... Well, I hope I read this the other day. I assume it's true. Over 200 clubs have signed a sort of... whatever they have signed to have an SGM. That tells you... the strength of feeling, whether or not it's justified, it's there, and that is always a real concern. The last big one like this was was that which actually sort of dribbled away was the tackle law.
Yes, it was.
And that, again, the communication was pretty poor. The way that was...
There was no communication. And looking back at it, it was all based on fake science and, poor advice. So it was based on... Well, it was. Because if they'd waited for, a year, just a year... We've been playing this game for about 100 years now. If we waited a year, you had a much more authoritative report, which claimed actually rugby at amateur levels not really that much more dangerous than trampolining. And you think,
I suppose a cynic would say that the most ironic thing of this whole thing is that I think we've touched on a few things about sort of corporate communications from the organisation in the last few years, but of course I think that the communications director was one of the people on the 6 in the long-term incentive scheme. So that's fairly ironic.
Yes, it is.
Who I think has subsequently moved on. But I mean, the only thing we haven't really touched on. Do I think that long-term incentive plans have a place in organisations like the RFU?
I think absolutely. I don't. I would disagree with that. I think the problem is not the time frame of the incentive; it's the quality of the incentive and how well thought through it is. If it's a good incentive, there's no reason not to. I'm
not completely convinced. I disagree to I think then in that case, I'm not sure this is the type. I understand where it's come from. I know its history in the corporate world. The argument is usually that you are able to tie in your key executives for the long run, and therefore it acts as a protection against them being poached. I'm not sure I buy that entirely when it comes to an organisation like the RFU, whereby I just don't also believe in this whole comparability stuff. Well, if the bloke from the, Lawn Tennis Association gets this, then I should get that. And if I get that, then the guy from football should get this. And it just becomes a never-ending cycle of comparability. And all that ends up with is the situation where the gap between what people are paid at the very top of the organisation and what people are paid, the most people in the organisation are paid, gets wider and wider and wider.
Do you know the example that I can think of with this?
I just don't buy it, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and the example I can give of this comparative pay was building societies around 2007, 2008, where they would say, well, Barclays are paid X, so why shouldn't the head of Bradford and Bingley get paid Y? And you think, this is nuts. You're a small building society. Grow up. But it happens all the time.
And there's a conflict of interest here about this comparability thing. It becomes a never-ending. Well, here we all are. These who I should be compared with. The minute one of them gets a rise, that entitles apparently everybody else of that in a similar place gets a rise.
I'll give you another one as well. Marquee players, or fly halves. Once one gets a pay rise, you're paying them all. Yeah.
So I don't. I suppose one of my observations in this whole thing, there's a number of observations here, aren't there? But one of mine is I just do not accept this kind of approach is appropriate in this type of organisation. I mean, I'm not a big fan of them per se. This is outside the remit of what we're talking about, but I think they've been one of the things that have skewed relative earnings over the last 3, 4, 5 decades in a very unfortunate way, and I certainly don't think they're appropriate. And you get this. You've only got to look actually at the level of pay for chief executives in Premiership football to see where this goes.
Yeah.
I mean, these are not huge companies, okay? They're not. The argument is the one we've already and I don't buy it, but the argument is the one we've already touched on. Yes, but they're very, very high profile. You're effectively paying me danger money for the profile and the abuse that I will have to take if things don't go well.
Definitely, to be fair, I have much more sympathy for a head of a Premiership football club and his pay packet than Bill Sweeney's. Because they do have a shareholder. It's up to the shareholders what they get paid. That's fine. Because the RFU is a member body, it's different. But I'll just throw one thing out, and this is one of my more controversial takes, but I think it's a societal problem. I think we've got a general breakdown in standards of what people think is acceptable and what they don't. And the way that I look at this is, look how much heads of charities get paid, and what they demand. And a charity, they're expecting something for free from people that don't donate, and yet they're willing to plunder that money to feather their own nests. And as a society, we say, yeah, absolutely fine, because we need the professionalisation. And a lot of the times we don't. I think something very similar is with the RFU. And the big difference I have with everything that you've said today is you said, well, I'm not sure it's self-interested. I'm absolutely 100% certain it is self-interested. And I think we've got a whole cadre of people that think it's okay just to swan around these types of organisations, whether it be NGOs or charities or member organisations, and just demand the maximum pay because, I don't know, someone who answers to shareholders gets maximum pay. And I think that's a really toxic thing, a toxic element of society which has developed in the last, say, decade, 15 years.
This will come as no surprise to our listener that I fundamentally disagree with that. I think that's a classic right-wing diversionary tactic away from corporate excess.
Oh no, corporate excess. Go for it, right? Because all that you're doing is costing your shareholders. But there should be an element of duty when you work for a charity or a union.
I disagree.
I mean, there maybe should be an element of duty when you work for a corporate too, but less so.
I disagree. A, on a number of levels. B, I don't. This idea that corporations only have shareholder interests, that is it's so outdated as to be laughable. But you've only got to look at the data that shows you the change in the distribution of income between CEOs, particularly in the United States, but increasingly in Europe, and the people who work for them is getting larger and larger and larger. And it's self-justified, and I think it's... and I don't buy the idea that as long as the shareholders agree, that I think that's that the shareholder, the range of shareholding, particularly in listed companies, is so huge that unless you get some kind of shareholder activist group going, the level of accountability is very, very small indeed. Well, I think one of the ways in which people who benefit from that, which I'm fundamentally opposed to, is to divert and point to things like charities. Now, this is ridiculous, all right, because you are lumping together almost like a sort of mom and pop charity that does, often set up to in somebody's memory or what have you, very, very small, does, I'm sure, great work in some ways, but they're a tiny, tiny organisation, right? To compare that to some of the highly complex, incredibly difficult to run, and vitally important organisations in that sector is ludicrous.
No.
So, like saying, I'm not doing. We'll treat the people running an under sevens in the park the same as with the person running the largest sports organisation in the country. It's nonsense.
No. That is not what I said, right? And not only is it not what I said, I'm not the one comparing those two things. It's the people that appoint these individuals to charities which say it, which they'll say it is a large, complex organisation, whether it be...
Which is true.
Right? And
some of them are.
And therefore, we need an individual who has large, complex expertise. And actually, what my point would be is, yes, you probably do need that person, but that person needs to come for free or take an enormous pay cut because there is an element of duty.
But hold on a minute. What do you mean this person should come for free? You're one of these people now, right, who basically says, and it's a right-wing online trope.
Why is it online? I mean, you're sounding very much like the RFU president now.
No.
You are.
No, I'm not.
It's clickbait.
I'm saying this is
it's
a
not
classic. This is an absolute classic way of attacking a particular sector. Is to say, well, they should be working for free. Well, that's a ludicrous
the
suggestion.
whole RFU council works for free.
They don't run the organisation.
But they do work for free, right? And I'm not saying necessarily free, but a discount. I mean, look, if someone said to me...
Hold on a minute. I know what you're saying. I just think you're wrong. That's all.
I mean, look, if I was independently
you
wealthy...
are confusing people who volunteer to help their local rugby club or who may volunteer to help a charity they support with the people who are actually running it full time. If the organisation is big enough, and only some sports are, right, to have a reasonably large balance sheet, to have a reasonably large number of people employed, to have a reasonably large remit, then the people who run that, the senior executives, are going to be paid a reasonable salary. The idea, you would be, well, I'll tell you what, next time we meet, you come up with some examples, right? Some specific examples of charities whose are led by people whose salaries you think are out of kilter.
Oh, wonderful! I've got a list of them.
Well, fine, and then I will bring. In comparison, who will promise to do this rather than talking to us, I will bring a list of what I consider to be grossly overpaid chief executives from the private sector. But
the irony here is I'm not making that comparison. You're making that comparison. I think the trope here is say, well, don't look at the injustices of people like working for member-led organisations. Look at this injustice, and I think two things can be true at once. I think you're probably right about corporate pay.
No, what I'm saying is this trope about people who run charitable organisations.
Not all of them, for the record. Only the big ones.
Diversion. That's what I'm saying. It comes from people who wish to divert the public's attention from the far more heinous and significantly higher.
I don't want to divert the attention from that. I think it's a really important point that you bring up. I just don't think that they're related. Let's park that before we start shouting at each other, which is always good fun, and bring our examples through next time. We'll do a 20-minute little thing on it. 20 minutes of charity pay and corporate excess.
Yes,
wonderful
absolutely.
stuff.
That's what our listener wants to hear.
Don't they just? I was going to ask you for 5 minutes on your views of the RFU Council, but let's not bother with that because I quite like this ending.
Okay. Fair enough.
All right, Mark. Well, we'll catch up in the new year. Have a wonderful Christmas.
And you.
I'll speak to you in January.
Yeah, take care, mate. All the best.
Take care.
Hi, this is Farnoosh Torabi, host of the Webby-winning podcast, So Money. If you're aiming for a goal, be it saving for a house, growing your family, or retiring, life makes it difficult to stay the course. But with a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan and a clear path forward. Having the bull at your back helps your whole financial life move with you. So when your plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
When you're part of a military family, you understand sacrifice and support. At American Public University, we honor your dedication by extending our military tuition savings to your extended family. Parents, spouses, legal partners, siblings, and dependents all qualify for APU's preferred military rate of just $250 per credit hour for undergraduate and master's level programs. American Public University. Value for the whole family. Learn more at apu.apus.edu/military.